Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, Amir Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Nun Zayin Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very top line of Nun Zayin Amid Beis with the new Siman. Siman Reish Ayin Zayin Shaloi Ligroim Kibui Haner. You may not do something that is going to cause the extinguishing of a ner. Ubai he seifim, and here we have 5 seifim. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanisunim Bartzaru Bashivya Haimdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakayim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yitziah Mitzara L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Oira Mishibed L'Geula Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emaramein. Our learning should be a schus for Fui Shalem for Tzvi Ben Leah Miriam, and our learning should be a schus for Yisrael Ben Rachel, Yonasan Ben Michal, and Yael Ben Michal. The Rebbeinu Shalom should protect them together with all of our brothers and sisters in harm's way. B'chol Makayim Shehem. So here we have a brand new siman. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, a very interesting siman, a siman that has a lot of applications. Halacha Lamaisa. Says the Mechaber, Ner Shemunach Achoirei Hadelis. Now, literally, these words mean a ner that is placed, a ner that is sitting behind a door. And we'll get to exactly what that means momentarily. Says the Mechaber, Asar liftayach hadeles, you are not allowed to open the door, and the Ramah interjects with the word kedarkoi. You're not allowed to open the door in the normal fashion. The implication being that there is a way that you are allowed to open the door. We're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah is going to bring down from the Magen Avram that this word kedarkai is actually a ta'as sefer. It's a typo. It does not belong here, and it doesn't have any validity over here. We'll see that in the Mishnah Berurah. Now, why is it that you're not allowed to open this door? Continues the Mechaber on the second line down. Shema yechabenu haruach. The problem is that by opening the door, the wind may extinguish the flame. The wind may come, blow in, and it may blow out the flame. Okay, let's pause here for a moment, and let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Aleph, Ner. The first thing that the Mishnah Berurah tells us is that b'negeya to this halacha, in the context of this halacha, the very first halacha of Siman Reish Ayin Zayin, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein chilik bazeh beiner shel shemen oishava v'chelif. Over here, by this halacha, it makes no difference whether we're talking about an oil lamp or we're talking about a solid fuel lamp, a candle, either a candle made out of wax or a candle made out of tallow, some kind of fat. It doesn't matter. This halacha applies equally because the worry over here has nothing to do with movement of the fuel. This is not a problem of the oil moving closer to the wick or further away from the wick. This is a problem that you have a flame, and we're afraid that the flame might get blown out. Doesn't matter if the flame is on an oil lamp or the flame is on a candle. Now we come to Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Beis. Again, the words of the Mechaber here were, a ner shemunach achoirei hadelis. We're talking about a ner, a lamp, or a candle that is placed behind a door. Now, the truth is that these words are taken right out of a brisa in Masechta Shabbos Daf Kuf Chaf Amid Beis. The question is, what does achoirei hadelis mean? We have a ner that's placed behind the door. And here we have a major machlokes rishonim, precisely what this means. We have basically 3 different scenarios, and the truth is that the Mechaber is going to cover all 3 scenarios. The first, most basic understanding of achoirei hadelis would be Rashi's pshat. Rashi's pshat in achoirei hadelis is, it doesn't really mean that the lamp is behind the door. What it means is like this. When we look at a door, and the Mishnah Berurah, let's see the Mishnah Berurah inside. Mishnah Berurah is Katan Beis. Achoirei hadelis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ki delis sheniftakas lifnim. We're talking about a door that opens inwards. So you're standing outside the house, or outside the house. You go to the door, and you're going to open the door, and you're going to swing the door in. Ume achareha, behind the door. What does behind the door mean? Well, when you swing a door inwards, you generally would call the inside of the door the back of the door. When you're standing outside the house and you're by the door, you're standing in front of the door. When you swing the door inward, right? What's called behind the door? Something that's within the room is behind the door. Now, if you're talking about a very large room, if you're talking about a 30-foot room, and the nair is located on a credenza 30 feet away on the other side of the room, you're not going to say that the nair is behind the door. But we're talking about here, as we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, we're talking about a small room. And therefore, we call this Achorei Hadelis. Now, when the Mishnah Berurah says over here that we're talking about a scenario where the door goes inward, the same halacha is going to apply if the door swings outwards. There's going to be no difference, halacha lamaisa, which direction the door swings, in or out. The reason the Mishnah Berurah says that the door is swinging inwards is because he's explaining, according to Rashi, that's why the Brisa refers to this as a ner achorei hadelis. The reason it's called a ner achorei hadelis is because since the door swings inwards, the ner that's within the room on the other side of the door is called being behind the door. If the door would swing outwards, we really wouldn't call the nair behind the door. Because what do you mean? You swung the door outwards, the door is not even in the room anymore. So what do you mean the nair is behind the door? The door is over there. So it's not behind the door. Yeah, technically when the door is closed, it's behind the door. But when you open it, it's not behind the door. In that case, we would kind of call the front of the door, something outside the room, we would call it behind the door. So that's why the Mishnah Berurah says over here that the case, if you're picturing the case is a door that swings inwards, and the nair is within the room. Why is it called Achorei Hadelis? Behind the door, because the door swings inwards. And I'll see the Mishnah Berurah again. So, keep going. Delish and niftakas lifnim, you have a door that opens inwards, umei achareha, and behind it, within the room, munach babayis ner doluk, there's a lit lamp within the room. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'davka kishu neged psichas hadelis mamish. First of all, in order for this halacha to be nageya, for this halacha to apply, it has to be that the nair is really truly opposite the door. Not that the door is over here and the nair is in the room all the way to the left or all the way to the right. The nair has to be opposite the door. V'karoiv el hadelis. And the nair has to be close to the door. Be'inyan shekishiyiftach hadelis yuchal lihikavos al yedei haruach hamanashe mibachutz. And that's why you have a problem over here opening the door, because when you open the door, you're allowing the wind from outside to blow in. The lit nair is directly opposite the door, and it's very close to the doorway. So when you swing the door in, the wind could come in and blow out the nair. That's why the Mechaber says that when you have a nair that's behind the doorway, you're not allowed to open the door, because by opening the door, this is either a psik reisha or at least karuv lipsik reisha. It's inevitable, or almost inevitable at least, that when you open the door, the wind is going to come in and blow out the nair, and therefore it's aser. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, umashe kasav kedarkoi. This that the Ramah interjected over here, the word kedarkoi, that you're not allowed to open the door in the normal way, which carries an implication that there is a way in which you can open the door. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ayin b'Magen Avram, take a look at the Magen Avram, Shekasav writes, D'ta Seferhu. That word is a typo. It doesn't belong here. Because even if you open the door gently, it's totally irrelevant how you open the door. Nevertheless, the wind is still going to blow in and is still going to blow the nair out. The Chavetz Chaim says that a lot of Achronim take the position, they agree with the Magen Avram, that the word Kedarkoi does not belong here. V'ayin b'bir halacha, where the bir halacha brings down those who disagree with the Magen Avram. Having said that, he says that the majority of Achronim agree with this Magen Avram, that this word Kedarkoi has no place over here at all. Mishnah Berurah is cutting Gimel. What's the whole problem here with opening the door? The problem is that by opening the door, you're going to allow the wind to blow in and blow out the nair. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Gimel. Ayin b'Magen Avram Siman Tafkuf Yodal Sif cutting Yud. Da'afilu im eina ruach menashev ata. Let's say you're about to walk into the house and you remember, I learned in the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, I learned this halacha that if I have a nair opposite the door and it's very close to the door, I'm not allowed to open the front door of the house. And I happen to know that my Hanukkah menorah is positioned inside the room, very, very close to the door, opposite the doorway. So now I have a problem. I can't open the door. But wait a second. Right now, outside, it's still as anything. There's absolutely no wind. There isn't even a slight breeze. Am I allowed to open up the door? Says the Mishnah Berurah, he brings down from the Magen Avram, even if right now the wind is not blowing, gam ken yesh lesar. There still is a very strong reason to say that it's aser. Why? Because the nature of wind is that it changes from second to second. 1 second is no breeze, the very next second there is a breeze. And therefore the Magen Avram says, there is no way to know that when you're opening the door, a breeze isn't going to come. And therefore, the Magen Avram seems to feel that you still have to look at this as being either a psik ratio or karav l'psik ratio, that when you open the door, you might go to open the door, and precisely when you open the door, the wind is going to blow. And in that case, your act of opening the door, even though it's a davar she'ein miskavin, you certainly don't intend to blow out the nair, but it's at least karav l'psik ratio that when you open the door, the nair is going to go out. However, having said that, the Mishnah Berurah says, "V'yesh mekilin bazeh." There are those that are mekel in this case, and they hold that if there's mamish no wind blowing, then you don't have to worry about it. And he brings down, if you look at the Biur Halacha, he brings this down. He says that the El Yerabah, the Mata Yehuda, they they seem to agree that if there's no wind, that's the El Yerabah, the Mata Yehuda, right? She'eskim l'divrei ha'ma'aril. Okay. And the Ramah, that if you see that there's no wind, yeah. Okay. Yesh b'kilin b'zeh. Venerally, the Chavetz Chaim says, it appears to me, under pressing circumstances, yesh lahakel b'zeh, you could be mekel, if you open the door gently, so the Mishnah Berurah is saying that under pressing circumstances, where you feel that you have to open the door, you could be mekel, but you have to avoid a secondary problem. In other words, I want to be clear on this. The Magen Avram says, the Mechaber says, you have a nair positioned opposite the door, very close to the door. You're not allowed to open the door to the outside because you have to be concerned that the wind will come in and blow out the nair. The Mishnah Berurah brings down from the Magen Avram, even if it's very still outside and there's no breeze and there's no wind, the Magen Avram says you still have to be choshish for this because the wind is completely unpredictable. And it could be that you're going to put your hand on the knob, turn the knob, and just as you're opening the door, the wind is going to come. And you have to be concerned for that. The Mishnah Berurah says, there are those that are mekel. In the Biur Halacha, he says that one of the ones that are mekel is the El Yerabah. But at the same time, if you look at the Biur Halacha, the Chavetz Chaim says that the El Yerabah has a secondary problem. And that is that the El Yerabah is also concerned with the breeze that you're going to generate by swinging the door. So the El Yerabah is still machmir on opening the door, even if there's no wind outside, because he's concerned that you're going to generate a breeze when you swing the door, and that might put the nair out. That's why the Mishnah Berurah says over here that in Makam Atchak, under pressing circumstances, you could be mekel if you open the door gently. That way, first of all, we could rely on the shittas that say, not like the Magen Avram, that if there's no wind outside, you don't have to be concerned with wind, and we'll avoid the El Yerabah's problem by opening the door gently, so you don't generate a breeze that will put out the nair. Okay. Says the Ramah. So far, we've seen over here halacha number 1 in Siman Reish Ayin Zayin. What's that halacha? That halacha is, if you have a nair that is positioned opposite the front door of the house, and not only is it positioned opposite the front door of the house, but it's very close to the door, so that it is very possible that when you open the door, the wind will come in and it will blow out the nair, you're not allowed to open the door. Okay. Says the Ramah, third line down the middle of the line. This is probably an application that is much more negaya to us. Baruch Hashem, most of us have pretty much larger houses than what's being described over here. I think it's pretty rare that we have the nair very close to the front door of the house and mamish opposite the front door. It could happen, small rental apartments, etc., etc. It could happen. But what is more common is the case of the Ramah here. What if you lit the Shabbos neiris on the dining room table, and directly opposite the neiris on the table, you have a window, and it's taka very close to the window? Are you allowed to open up that window? Says the Ramah, no. You're not allowed to open that window for the same reason. You have to worry that you're going to open the window's going to come in and blow out the nair. Oh, I skipped. I'm sorry. I skipped some of the words of the Ramah here. Let's go back to the second line down here on Nun Zayin Amud Beis near the end of the line. So we learned over here that you're not allowed to open the door. Oh, says the Ramah like this near the end of line 2. Aval linoil hadelis kinegdai. How about the opposite case? Not that you're going to go open the door. Let's say you want to close the door. You have the nair opposite the door, and the door is opened, and there's wind coming in through the door, and you're afraid that the nair is going to blow out. So now you want to go ahead and you want to close the door. So why are you closing the door? Well, you're closing the door to prevent the nair from being extinguished. So you're closing the door to extend the lifetime of the flame. Says the Ramah, Valina Hadelis Kenegdoi, but to close the door that's opposite the nair, mutter. That's mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Daled. Mutter. That's mutter. Shebazeh ena oise klum. You're not doing anything. Loi mechabe v'loi mavir. You're not causing the fire to be extinguished. You're not causing the fire to grow. So you're not doing a malacha that has anything to do with kibui. By closing the door, are you doing anything that has to do with extinguishing the nair? No. If anything, you're doing it to preserve the lifetime of the nair. You're doing it to keep the nair going. At the same time, are you doing havara? By closing the door, are you making the fire get bigger? So no. So you're not doing mavir. So you're not impinging on the malacha of mavir. You're not impinging on the halacha of malacha of kivui. You're not doing anything by closing the door. So therefore, says the Ramah, that's 100% mutter to go ahead and do that. You're not affecting the flame in any way, shape, or form. Now it's interesting because there's a whole discussion amongst the Paiskim. And I think if you look at one of the Dirshu footnotes, you can see some mention of it. There's a whole discussion amongst the Paiskim that's a very contemporary, not so contemporary anymore maybe, but if you go back 10, 15 years ago, for sure, a more contemporary shaila. And that is Shabbos clocks. And believe it or not, this is the very first shaila that I ever asked a Paisik in my life. I was probably at the time 10 years old. And I came up with the following shaila. In my house, growing up in the apartment that we had, we used a Shabbos clock on the lamps in the living room. And one Friday night, somebody, I think it was like around this time of year when the clock was changing, somebody didn't adjust the clock properly, and I was in the middle of reading something, sitting on the couch in the living room, and the lights went off. So I started wondering the following shaila. Let's say I look down at the Shabbos clock. Now in those days, it was the type of analog Shabbos clock that had the metal tabs that you pull in that you could either put onto the clock or take off of the clock, and those were the trippers that would trip the switch to turn on and turn off the light. So let's say I look at the clock and I see that the tripper is installed so that the lamp is going to turn off in a half an hour. I don't want it to turn off in a half an hour. I want it to stay on. Can I pull the tripper out? By pulling the tripper out, what am I doing? Am I doing mavir? Am I making something burn? Am I turning on a light? No. Am I doing kibui? Am I making a lamp go out? No, adarab. I'm making the lamp stay on longer. Am I doing anything wrong? I think it's Reb Shlomo Zalman, Zechet Tzadik Levracha, who says, from this halacha over here, he says, l'chayr, it's the same halacha. What's the halakha of the Ramah over here? You're afraid that the wind coming in from the window or the wind coming in from the door is going to blow out the ner. So you want to shut the window to preserve the ner. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're allowed to do that because you're not doing anything. Said Rav Shlomo Zalman, l'chayr it's the same thing. What do you want to do? You want to take out the metal tripper. What are you doing by taking out the metal tripper? Nothing. Are you doing mavir? No. Are you doing kiboy? No. What are you doing? You're not doing anything. At the same time, they say that Rav Shlomo Zalman told people halacha l'maisa not to do it unless there was a very pressing need to do it. Other poskim disagree. Most notably, I think Rav Moshe disagreed with this, and Rav Moshe held Yamamish not allowed to do it. I asked this shaila, it happens to be, now I call him my Rebbe, my Rabbi Rabbi Reuben Feinstein Shlita, Rav Moshe's son. At that time, he wasn't my Rebbe yet. But I met him at an event. On that Motzei Shabbos, I met him by an event. So I walked over to him and I asked him, are you allowed to do this? And he told me no. And I remember I asked him why. He told me there's a lot of reasons, but I'll give you a very basic one. And I said, what's that? And he told me the Shabbos clock is muktzah. You're not allowed to touch it. You're not allowed to be metaltal the Shabbos clock. So you're not allowed to take the tripper out and pull the tripper out simply because it's muktzah. You're not allowed to be metaltal it. But he told me then there are more complicated reasons as well, also why you're not allowed to do it. But that's what it's rooted, at least partially, in this discussion over here. Okay. So what have we seen so far? Halacha number 1. You have a ner that's sitting on a table or a countertop or what have you in a room. It's opposite the front door of the house, and it's close to the front door of the house, so that it is a very reasonable expectation that if you open the front door to the house, the wind is going to come in and blow out the ner. You're not allowed to open that door because of this chashash. We saw in the Mishnah Berurah for the Magen Avram, this is true, even if at that moment the wind happens not to be blowing. You're still not allowed to go ahead and open it. Says the Ramah, how about if the door or the window is open and you want to shut it in order to preserve the flame? That you're allowed to do. Continues now the Mechaber 4 lines down the middle of the line. Now we come to another case. Now, this case is based on the Rabbeinu Hananel's understanding of the Brisa in Masechta Shabbos that talks about the ner that's a choyrei hadelis. The first pshat that we've seen over here is based on Rashi. Rashi's understanding of the ner achorei hadelis is a ner within the room, close to the door. It's called achorei hadelis because the door swings in. Therefore, it's called ner that's achorei hadelis. The Rabbeinu Hananel looks at it. Rabbeinu Hananel says, no, that's not what it means at all. You know what it means? It means that you have a room, again, a small, relatively small room. The door is going to swing inward. So when you open the door, you're going to go like this. Now, right over here, there's a wall. I don't have enough hands, maybe, to do this properly, but I don't know. Let's say, forget it. So you have the door is going to swing in like this. Right over here, there's a wall. And on that wall, let's say you have a shelf. And on the shelf, there's an air, there's a lamp. What's going to happen if you just go to the door and you slam it open? It's going to bang into the shelf. When it bangs into the shelf, it might cause the lamp to go out. According to the Rabbeinu Hananel, we understand very clearly why this is called a ner achorei hadelis. It mamish is behind the door. When you open the door, the ner is over here behind the door. The problem is, you open the door, you bang into the ner, or you bang into the shelf that the ner is on, you're going to cause the ner to go out. So now, the Mechaber addresses that scenario. Says the Mechaber, V'imu kavua ba'kaisel sha'achorei hadelis. Let's say the lamp is attached to the wall that's behind the door, or it's on a shelf attached to the wall behind the door. Also, liftayach hadelis ulena aloi kedarkoi. In this case, it makes sense to use the word kedarkoi. You're not allowed to open, now the Mechaber says, or close. Now that we're going to have to understand. We're going to look at the Mishnah Berurah. But the Mechaber says you're not allowed to open or close the door in the normal fashion. Why? Because the door might bang into the air, and it might put it out. Ella, what could you do? You can't open it in the normal fashion. You have to take care. You have to open it gently so that you shouldn't bang into the nair and put the nair out. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hey, kavua b'kaisel. If the nair is attached to the wall, what the Mechaber means to say is, shahadelas paisachas lifnim. Again, we're talking about a door that swings inwards. V'haner kavua b'kaisel. The nair is attached to the wall, ba'ofen in such a manner that if you pasach hadeles, if you open the door, tinkosh, it's going to bang. V'sagia el nair sha'ala achareh, and it's going to bang into the nair that's located behind it. And therefore, you're not allowed to open it in the normal way. Instead, you have to open it gently and make sure you don't bang into the lamp. Now, Ois Katan Vav. The Mechaber said you can't open it in the normal fashion, and you can't close it in the normal fashion. Now, using the explanation that we just gave, what on earth would be wrong with closing the door in the normal fashion? When you're closing the door, you're swinging it away from the lamp. What's the problem? So therefore, it says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Vav, v'achrayim kasvu, the achrayim write, to bazeh, that in this scenario, lin oil shari, to close the door is perfectly mutter, to lo yavai al yedei zeh likibui, because by closing the door, you're not going to do anything that's going to cause the lamp to go out. However, take a look at the Pri Begadim. Sheyishev k'tzas divrei haMechaber. He reconciles the words of the Mechaber. The Meiri, he says, the Mechaber is talking about a case shenoyal b'koyach, where if you close the door in the normal fashion, it's going to close very hard. So what? We're talking, I guess, about a little bit of a flimsy structure. And if you close the door hard, the whole wall is going to shake. And that vibration of the wall itself might make the candle go out. Even if it might not make the nair go out, but it might vibrate the wall to the extent that the oil inside the nair will flow a little bit away from the wick and reduce the size of the flame. And that would be kibui. Or by shaking the wall, you might have the opposite effect. You might cause the oil to slosh towards the wick, and you might make the flame get bigger, which would be mavir. V'yischayev mishum mavir. Okay, so here the Mechaber addressed the Rabbeinu Chananel's pshat. So this was scenario number 2. Scenario number 2 that we're calling achoyrei adeles is that you have a nair that's attached to the wall behind the door so that the door might hit it. Therefore, to open the door in the normal fashion is a problem because you might hit the nair and extinguish it. The Mechaber says to close the door in the normal fashion is also a problem. Mishnah Berurah says some achrayim take that out because they say there's no problem with closing the door. The Pri Begadim says in some cases there could be a problem with closing the door. What's that? A flimsy structure where if you close the door, you're going to shake the nair and you might come to either mavir or kibui by making the oil either flow to the wick or away from the wick. Now we go further in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, this is now 5 lines down, last word on the line, another scenario, and this is based on the pshat given by Tosfos in Masechta Shabbos of Achoyrei Adeles. V'imu kavua b'adeles atzmoi. Oh, now we have an interesting one. You have a door, and the door on the back of it has a shelf. And on the shelf, on the door, you have an air. So now, when you open and close the door, you're actually moving the nair, because the nair is attached to the door itself. Says the Mechaber, V'imu kavua b'adeles atzmoi, if the nair is mamish attached to the door, so that shepsichasai uni'ilasai, opening the door or closing the door, has the effect of mekarev hashemen laner, either making the oil flow to the wick, oy marchikai bimenu, or making the oil flow away from the wick. So then, asur lepaschei olanalai, then it's completely asur to open or close this door, because if you make the oil flow to the wick, you're being over on mavir. If you make the oil flow away from the wick, you're being over on kibui. So that completes all 3 scenarios brought down in the Rishonim for what it means in the Brisa that a ner achoyrei hadeles, you're not allowed to open or close the door. Says Mishnah Berurah Katan Zayin, Mekarev Hashemen. V'yesh bazeh mishum mavir oy mechaber. Even though you certainly have no intent to either reduce the size of the flame or increase the size of the flame, but it's still also because this is a psik ratio. It's an inevitable result of the maisa that you're doing. But even if the nair is attached to the back of the door, if you open and close the door very gently, in such a manner that it is not inevitable that the flame will get bigger or smaller, then it's mutter, because it's a davar she'eina miskaven and it's not a psik reisha. Now the Mishnah Berurah brings up a very interesting question, which really brings us into the entire topic of the next shir. And that is, if you have a nair that's attached to the door, there's another problem that comes to mind right away. And that is the problem of a basis l'davar ha'aser. We know the halacha that the nair itself, the lamp itself, is muktzah. Now the muktzah nair is resting on the door. So the door is the base. The door is the base that is supporting the davar muktzah. And we know that a basis l'davar aser is aser. When something is serving as the base for something, for the base and the support for something that's muktzah, then in many cases, there's a lot of guidelines to this halacha, but in many cases, that base is also muktzah. So why don't we say over here that the door itself is muktzah because it's a basis? So forget the idea that you're not allowed to open and close the door because you might impinge on the malacha of mavir or mechabe. L'chayri, you can't open or close the door because you can't move the door. The door is muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, that's wrong thinking. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ve'ein iser b'tiltal adelis b'shum haner hamuktzah kavua ba. We're not going to say it's usher to move the door because the door is a basis l'davar usher by virtue of the fact that it has a nair on it. Why? Because what's the whole underpinning of the halacha of basis? The whole underpinning of the halacha of basis is that when you have something that's muktzah and it is sitting on something else, the item that is serving as the base and the support for the muktzah item is considered to be subservient to the muktzah item. It's bottled to the muktzah item, and therefore it gets the same din as the muktzah item. But that's not true in this case. There's no way that you could say that the door is now subservient to the nair. If anything, the nair maybe is subservient to the door. The door is the ikr, the nair is the tafel. The door serves a very, very critical purpose in the house. You want to open it and close it. There's no way we're going to say that the door is now bottled to the nair and the door becomes a basis. Like the Mishnah Berurah says, Levi shadelis loinasis basis l'nair, Levi shachashuva, because the door itself is too chashuv. Shemishameshes labayis. The door serves the needs of the house. Ubetela etzloi. If anything, the door is bottled to the house. The door is not bottled to the nair, that it should be considered a basis. Continues the mechaber. Actually, continues the Ramah 3 lines from the bottom. Hago, says the Ramah, in this last case that the mechaber just gave us, where what's the concern? In this last case, the concern is that the nair is on the door, and by moving the door, you're going to make the oil either flow closer to the wick, so now you're over on mavir, you're making the flame get bigger, or you're going to make the oil flow away from the wick, and you're going to be over on mechabe, making the nair get smaller. Says the Ramah, Haga, ubener shel shava, but if you're talking about a candle with a solid fuel, if you're talking about a wax candle, mutter liftayach v'lanoyal. It would be mutter to open and close the door, even if the nair is attached to the door, because by a solid fuel, there is no concern of mavir or mechabe. You're not making anything go closer or further away to the wick, so there is no mavir or mechabe. Says the Mishnah Berurah, shel shava, v'shel kelev, or if it's a fat candle, a tallow candle, because that mitzias doesn't exist, it's a solid fuel. Now, if it's a scenario, let's say it's a very tiny flame, and just by opening or closing the door, you might swing it in the wind and extinguish it, so then it would be usher to open or close the door, even if you're talking about a wax candle. By the way, the Poskim talk about a very interesting thing that flows out of this discussion here. What's the Ramah saying? The Ramah is saying that if you have a solid fuel candle attached to the door, you could open or close the door because there's no mavir, there's no mechabe. The concern of mavir is by an oil lamp. By swinging the door, you might make the oil go closer to the wick, which will result in the flame momentarily getting bigger. That would be mavir. If you make the oil go the other way, it's going to distance itself from the wick. The flame is momentarily going to get smaller. That would be mechabe. But by a candle, that's not a problem. Now, let me ask you a question. What happens when you move a solid fuel candle? The flame does what we would call flickering, right? It might have been a perfectly steady flame a second ago. Now, when you move the door, the flame is going to dance. Now, when that flame dances, if we would have a scientific way of measuring very closely what's happening to that flame, it's possible that for a nanosecond it's getting bigger, for a nanosecond it's getting smaller, but it's doing what we call flickering. It would seem that that's not a problem. So the Poskim talk about this. The Poskim say that from here, l'chayr, you have a raya that causing a flame to flicker. Now, when I use the word flicker, I don't mean to noticeably get smaller, noticeably get bigger. I mean to make the flame dance. The Poskim say that you see from here that that's not a problem. So to walk past a flame, and there's no chance you're going to blow it out, but when you walk past it, you generate enough of air movement that the flame dances. The Poskim say that that's not a problem. Causing the flame to flicker is not a problem. Okay, now we turn to Sif Beis, 2 lines off the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch. We spoke now about a lamp, a ner. Now we're going to speak about a madura. Now, a madura is a fire, right? I usually call it like a warming fire. What I mean by that is it's a fire built out of logs, built out of pieces of wood. It's a significant fire. It's not a flame. That's the difference between a ner and a madura. Says the Mechaber, also liftayach hadeles kineged hamadura. You're also not allowed to open up a door opposite a madura. Why? Opposite problem. By the ner, the problem with opening the door was the air might come in and blow out the ner. By a madura, we're not afraid that you're going to open the door, the wind is going to come in and put out the madura. The madura is too significant of a fire to go out from a breeze that's going to come in from the front door. But you know what is going to happen? Quite the opposite. When you open up the door and the breeze comes into the madura is going to get bigger, right? How do we make a madura bigger? We take a bellows and we blow air on it, and now it fires up because you're giving it more oxygen. So by opening up the door and allowing the wind, the breeze to blow on the madura, you're going to be over on mavir. You're going to make the flame bigger. So says the Mechaber, also liftayach hadeles keneged hamadura, you're not allowed to open up a door opposite a madura, shehi kroivik ksas el hadeles, if the madura is close to the door, va'afilu ein sham el ruach mitzuya, even if the wind outside is like a normal breeze, it's a ruach mitzuya. Avim im haya pasuach kenegda, but if the door was opened opposite the madura, mutar l'sagroi, you're allowed to close the door, ve'ein bay mishum mechabe, and there's no concern of mechabe. This is a loaded sif. Let's take a look over here at the Mishnah Berurah ice cut and test. So, the Mechaber said you're allowed to open up the door opposite the madura. Keneged hamadura. You're not allowed to. You're not allowed to open up the door opposite the madura. Why? Because the wind that's going to blow in, goyrim lahaver hamadura yoiser, is going to make the fire, the madura, get bigger. Even though you certainly have no intent to do that. Again, we're saying that this is a psik reisha. When you open the door, it's going to happen, that the wind is going to blow in and it's going to make it get bigger. Ice cut and yud said the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do this, even if the breeze outside is only a ruach mitzuya, it's a normal wind. What the Mechaber wants to say is, af the al yidei ruach mitzuya ein derech hamadura lahaver yoiser. Mishnah Berurah says, you know what the Mechaber is telling you? Even if it's a ruach mitzuya, it's very important. A ruach mitzuya, a typical wind, would not make the madura get bigger. We're really not worried about a ruach mitzuya. Still, afilu hachi aser. The Mechaber says it's still aser to open the door, because rinan atu she'ena mitzuya. Because we make a gzeira, the Gemara says, even though typically there's only a typical wind outside. And if you open the door and you let the typical wind blow on the Madura, it won't make it get bigger. But it's Xera. We're afraid that there might be a Ruach She'ena Mitzuya. So we're not going to let you open the door when there's a Ruach She'ena Mitzuya, because we're worried that there might be a Ruach... we're not going to let you open the door when there's a Ruach Mitzuya, a typical wind, because we're afraid you might come to open the door when there's a Ruach She'ena Mitzuya. And a Ruach She'ena Mitzuya, an atypical wind, would be a problem because it would make the fire get bigger. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, V'im ein sham ruach klal. How about if there's no wind? Then mutter, then it's mutter. And he brings this down from the Magen Avram. So the Magen Avram in this case says, if there's no wind, it's mutter. Now this is very interesting, because earlier this year we learned another Magen Avram. The Magen Avram said earlier that the Mechaber said you're not allowed to open the door opposite the Ner. Why? Because the wind might come and it might blow out the Ner. The Magen Avram said, what if there's no wind? The Magen Avram said, if there's no wind, it's still usher. Why? Because the wind is very unpredictable. It's nice that there's no wind now, but maybe as you're opening the door, the wind will blow, and it will blow out the Ner, and therefore it's usher. So by the Ner, the Magen Avram says, you're not allowed to open the door even if it's perfectly still outside. Over here, the Mechaber says, you're not allowed to open up the door opposite the Madura, because the wind will come in and make the Madura bigger. Right? Says the Magen Avram, what if there's no wind? If there's no wind, you're allowed to open up the door. What's the difference between these two halachas? The answer is very simple. The answer is that by the Ner, we're worried about a Ruach Mitzuya. By the Ner, we're worried about a typical wind. By the Ner, we're worried that if you open the door and a typical wind comes, it'll blow out the Ner. Therefore, the Magen Avram says, by the Ner, even if there's no wind, you're not allowed to open up the door. Why? Because we have to worry that a Ruach Mitzuya, a typical wind, might come right now when you're opening up the door. By the Madura, we're not worried about a typical wind. A typical wind, we said, is not going to do mavir. A typical wind is not going to make the fire get bigger. So we're really not worried about a typical wind. Why don't we let you open the door when there's only a typical wind outside? Because there's Xera, maybe an atypical wind will come. But now, if you're going to answer no wind, it's a double worry, right? Because what you're doing is, you're saying, I'm not going to let you open the door even if there's no wind. Why? There's no wind outside. Okay, the next level would be that a Ruach Mitzuya is going to come. But a Ruach Mitzuya is also not a problem. A Ruach Mitzuya is also not going to make the fire get bigger. But maybe a Ruach She'ena Mitzuya is going to come, and that would make the fire get bigger. What? We're going to worry when there's no wind that maybe there's going to be a Ruach She'ena Mitzuya? That far we're not going to worry. By the Ner, when there's no wind, we might worry that a Ruach Mitzuya will come. That's why over there it's Aser, and over here it's Mutter. Okay. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut yud. V'im al yedei defikas hadelas oisa ruach mitzuya. Now, how about if we have to worry that just by opening the door and closing the door, you're going to create a ruach mitzuya? Mashma b'chedush yarad the aser. From the chedush yarad, it's mashma that it's aser. Now we come to Mishnah Berurah ois cut yud aleph. Now, before I read Mishnah Berurah ois cut yud aleph, I want to direct you back to the words of the Mechaber in Sif Beis. So the Mechaber said like this. You have a Madura. You have a nice wood fire, a wood-burning stove, a fireplace, right? You're not allowed to open up the door opposite that Madura because the wind will come in and it will fire up the flames. It'll make them get bigger. Then the Mechaber said, how about if the door is opened? Well, if the door is opened, that means that the wind is blowing in and firing up the flames. Now you want to close the door. Okay, what's going to happen when you close the door? When you close the door, you're choking off that wind that was blowing in and making the fire get bigger. Said the Mechaber, you're allowed to do that. Mutter l'sagrei. You're allowed to close the door. Ve'ein by Mishah Mechaber. And there's no concern of Mechaber. Now, l'chayri, there's an open question here. Why not? And I'll make the question even bigger. In Siman Reish Nun Tes, we were talking about ovens, tanurim, we were learning the halachas of hatmana and everything else. And we learned over there that if you have a tanur, an oven, and the tanur has a fire inside, you are not allowed to completely close the door of the tanur on Shabbos. Why? Because what happens when you completely close the door of the tanur? You choke off the air supply. When you choke off the air supply, you're going to put the fire out. So you're not allowed to close the door of the oven because you're going to choke off the air supply and you're going to put out the fire. Why isn't that the same as here? Over here, you have a door open. The wind is blowing in. It's making the fire get big. You're going to close the door. You're going to shut off that air supply. It's going to make the fire get smaller. Says the Mechaber, it's mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yod Aleph. Mutter l'sagroi va'afal pisha ruach hayam avira. Even though until now the wind was coming in and it was firing up the flames, it was making it grow bigger. Ein by Mishum Mechaber, there's still no kivu here. She'enoi oisa klum, because you're not doing anything. Ela oitzer haruach. All you're doing is blocking the wind. Then tichpe. And if it goes down, it goes down. Now, Chavetz Chaim, in his goyness, Chavetz Chaim didn't give us a lot here to work with. The Chavetz Chaim told me over here, you know why you're allowed to do it? Because you're not doing anything. All you're doing is blocking off the air. Now, I mean, if I just want to play semantics, in Reish Nun Tes, I'm not doing anything. All I'm doing is choking off the air. The answer is, this is the way the Mefarshim seem to explain it. And again, this is Dirshu. This is a Dirshu Mishnah Berurah here. We do what we do. This is 30,000 feet. There's so many layers over here, I might say. We could spend hours just on this. Hours and hours and hours. But the key to this, the key to the understanding over here is that in Reish Nun Tes, we're talking about a fire in an oven. The airspace of the oven is very small. The air supply of the oven, of the flame in the oven, the fire counts on the air coming in from outside the oven. If you close the door to the oven, that is akin to taking the fuel out of the oven. That would be the same as taking the wood out of the oven, right? What does fire need? Fire needs spark, it needs air, it needs fuel. Take out any of those ingredients, you don't have a fire, right? If you take out the oxygen, there's no more fire. If you take out the wood, there's no more fire. In an oven, when you shut the door, you're taking out the air. That's what you're doing. There is no air. By a fireplace in a room, that's not the case. By a fireplace in a room, the fire has ample air supply. All of the air in the world is not the fuel for this fire just because your front door was open. The fire has ample fuel supply. It happens to be that right now, air from outside the house is blowing in. And the result of that air blowing in is that the fire is firing up. The flames are getting bigger. It happens to be that when you close that door, that's going to stop happening. But that's not called kibui, because that has nothing to do with the fire. The air that's coming in through that door and you closing the door has nothing to do with the fire. It may have an indirect effect on it, but it has nothing to do with it. That's why the Chavetz Chaim says, "Eno isaklum." You're not doing anything. What do you mean you're not doing anything? You're closing the door. What do you mean not doing? You're not doing anything to the fire. This is not called doing something to the fire. By the oven, closing the door is called doing something to the fire. That's one of the ways that you shut the fire. You close the door. When you have a big barbecue grill or a smoker, right, how do you shut the fire off? You close all the vents. That's how you shut the fire off. That's called doing something to the fire, right? But over here, you have a fireplace in the room. You have a door on the other end of the room. You close the door. You're not choking off the fire. It's not called doing something to the fire. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Gimel. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This was limud HaTorah. Should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shalom should send Yeshua for first part of it. Should do them to those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias Kal Tzedek. B'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.